Early Sunday morning, McLean, Virginia. Preparations for morning worship services begin just as on other Sundays. But this is a special Sunday. Today, the members of Lewinsville Presbyterian Church celebrate a birthday, the birthday of their church, an anniversary for this community of faith which has come together in worship and service for 140 years through struggle and growth, hardship and joy. This is their strength. It was 1846. President Polk had just declared war on Mexico. And 1846 was also the year that the Smithsonian Institution was founded in the nation's capital. And a few miles away in nearby northern Virginia, 1846 marked the beginning of another institution. In the fall of that year, a small group of Presbyterians laid the first foundations for a church here at what was known as Barrett's Crossroads. Frank Gapp, a Lewinsville member for over 38 years and our resident historian, talked with us about the origins of that early church.
The church is located in a corner of the John Tuberville property, so that when land was donated for church purposes, it was donated out of this probably surplus land in the Tuberville inheritance. And it was descendants of John Tuberville who donated the land, namely Martha Corbin Tuberville Ball.
Reverend William Maffitt was the first pastor. He lived in this house, Salona, which still stands off Dolly Madison Boulevard in McLean. It was to Salona that President James Madison fled during the burning of the White House in the War of 1812. It was here also that Reverend Maffitt first held church services in 1812, even though there was no formal church until 1846. The name most closely associated with the actual founding of the church is Commodore Thomas Ap Catesby Jones. During the War of 1812, young Lieutenant Jones served with distinction in the naval defense of New Orleans. Frank Gapp tells of the valiant fight by Jones and his men to fend off the British attackers.
They attacked Jones's ship, and Jones beat off the first attack. The second attack, Jones was wounded and carried below. The third attack, the British captured gunboat 156 and turned its guns on the rest, which soon gave up. Well, Jones was wounded in the left shoulder. He carried this bullet with him for the rest of his life, and was taken to Bermuda as a prisoner. But the investigation of the Navy after the war was over decided that the loss of the ships was really not Jones's fault, that he had conducted his defense under the best traditions of the Navy and was actually a hero. They commended him for his heroic conduct.
Jones, now a decorated war hero, returned to Northern Virginia.
His sister, Betty, was already living in the area, and it's probably through his sister that Jones became acquainted with Maffitt's daughter-in-law, his stepdaughter, I should say, Mary Walker Carter. In the course of time, Lieutenant Jones became engaged to Mary Walker Carter. They were to be married at Salona.
Jones' seafaring days were not over. He had 2 more tours of duty, both in the Pacific, before coming back to Northern Virginia and establishing himself as a leader in the community.
In 1845, he served on a commission that founded the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And in 1846, he was the key figure in establishing Lewinsville Presbyterian Church. There evidently was an agreement among all the people here that this was going to be established at this particular point, right here at Barrett's Crossroads. The congregation organized, they built the church, dedicated in January of 1847.
How many members were there in that first church?
So far as we know, there were only 17. it was a serious church. I don't know whether I can tell you how serious the Presbyterians were at that time, but I have here a directory of worship of the Presbyterian Church. And to give an idea of what a church service would be like, here is a paragraph from chapter 2 on the assembling of the congregation. In time of public worship, let all the people attend with gravity and reverence, forbearing to read anything except what the minister is then reading or reciting, abstaining from all whisperings, from salutations of persons present or coming in, and from gazing about, sleeping, smiling, and all other indecent behavior.
No sleeping allowed, Frank?
No sleeping, please.
For 10 or 15 years following the founding of the church grew rapidly. In 1852, the members prepared this friendship quilt, commemorating the Christian fellowship of the tiny new church by recording on the quilt the name of each member of the congregation. But the early church was no stranger to controversy. Reverend C.B. McKee came in 1857 and was immediately forced to resolve a certain, shall we say, ecclesiastical matter.
A woman had prayed in church, and it upset the elders no end. One of them threatened to resign because of it. And the first thing that the Reverend C.B. McKee did was to call a session together, and they discussed this. This is recorded in his diary, which I just happen to have here. And he tells how the session met, and after a considerable discussion, they decided they would do nothing about it because they said it might not happen again. But we know that a little bit later, Reverend McKee put in his diary that one of the members of the congregation left because he thought that anybody who wanted to pray in church should be able to.
Despite this early controversy, the church grew until the outbreak of the Civil War. Following several skirmishes, the Union troops decided to establish an outpost right here in the church.
There was a feeling that possibly the Confederates might attack and might try to recapture Lewinsville. So General Hancock issued an order that if it looked as though Lewinsville should fall to the Confederates, the troops should burn the church and the house across the street. And the troops had piled straw inside the church, preparatory to firing it. Well, about this time, the 5th Wisconsin came through, and they had with them another liberated woman who had decided that if the men of Wisconsin were going to go to war to save the Union, that she should be along too, to provide them with the comforts that only a woman could provide. And she was enough concerned about the church when she came in and saw all this straw around that she took our baptismal font and intended to bring it back to the church at a later date when it was safe from the Confederates. Now, I don't know exactly what happened to the 5th Wisconsin, but certainly Eliza T. Wilson never returned to the church. She went back to Wisconsin carrying our baptismal font.
The church structure itself suffered great physical damage during the war.
By the end of the war, the weatherboarding on the church had been ripped off, the fences had all been burned, the pews were gone. People had seen horses being taken into the church. Although this is typical, you took care of the horses, you put them inside, but the men were outside. And I'm sure that the Union forces did not take the best care of the church during the time they occupied it.
The U.S. government eventually paid the church $1,800 to cover the damage. Well, after the war, and indeed through the turn of the century, the church struggled to survive.
Money was very scarce, and the first indication we have, which is records of the Board of Trustees along about 1898, they were struggling for money. Some of the records indicate that total donations to missions would be something like $2.75 for the year. They were trying to reorganize, and they just barely maintained themselves economically.
Frank, when did the growth of the modern church really begin?
I suspect I have to go back to the time when Reverend William McElroy was pastor here. He was taking the session records one time into the presbytery in Washington to be approved. And he took the trolley from Roslyn, presumably, to go into presbytery, and fell asleep on the trolley, and suddenly realized he was passing his stop. So he jumped off the trolley and left the session records on the trolley, and we have never found them. The loss of the session records so upset the congregation that they evidently asked Reverend McElroy to leave. He disappeared all of a sudden, and for a while there were no meetings at the church. The Washington Presbytery decided that they had to revive some of these small country churches on the periphery of the city. And the pastors in Washington took this as one of their missions. The pastor of Western Presbyterian Church, the Reverend James Harvey Dunham, was assigned Lewinsville, and he came out here and preached for several Sundays, and interest revived in the church. And they got together enough confidence to ask him if he wouldn't serve as stated supply, and he did.
Reverend Dunham served 17 years, quite a long time for someone who was supposed to be only a stated supply minister. When the popular Reverend Dunham left in 1940, the church chose a young graduate of Princeton, Reverend Franklin B. Gillespie. Gillespie delivered the sermon at the 140th celebration on October 19, 1986. Every member of every stewardship committee can identify with Reverend Gillespie's account of the difficulty in establishing a budget and raising funds for the work of the church.
When I came, they didn't have any budget or anything of that type. They just raised what money they could, and most of it actually came from the dinners that the Ladies' Aid had served. That was the main thing that kept the church going. There was a total benevolence budget of $80. $75 of that went for the Vacation Bible School and things right here in the community. One woman, Virginia Clark, who lived in the house right across the street, gave $5 a year, which she stipulated. 1 year it was to go to foreign missions and 1 year to national missions. That was the total giving beyond the church. I insisted we have a budget for 1941, and they thought I was crazy when I suggested $3,200 and said, let's make 10% of it for benevolences. They thought they'd made a mistake in hiring this starry-eyed young dreamer. But anyway, we adopted the budget and we raised it. That was the beginning.
Under Reverend Gillespie's leadership, the membership grew.
I came about a year or so after Frank Gillespie had left. Reverend James F. Lundquist was pastor when I arrived here, and he was popular too.
And it was also about this time, 1952 to be exact, that the members prepared another friendship quilt, 100 years after the first. And again they included the names of all the members of the congregation at the time.
The church was in a period of great growth. The population of Washington was moving out into this area. The suburbs were growing. During the time that James Lundquist was here, the need for a new church building became obvious. We had passed 250 members, and it was while Jim Lundquist was here that we went to 2 morning services on Sunday. This was considered very radical at the time, but it was the only way we could get our congregation into the church.
Basically, it was a situation where you had to grow, but you didn't want to. For instance, the old church, where the pulpit had been taken out and stuck in the field, where the pews had been dragged out. They cut a hole in the side of the church during the Civil War to quarter the horses. Well, when you put that all back together and you win that award from Congress to restore the church, that means a lot to people who were there and who lived there, and yet still you had to grow, you had to expand, but you just didn't want to. So what we had to do is realize the human situation and temporize and compromise, and it was very difficult for the people.
In the midst of this difficult period of growth, leadership changed again. Reverend Lundquist was relieved by Reverend Howard Newman.
Now, Reverend Newman was a very good administrator, and he handled the session with something of an iron hand, and although he made some people angry, he did succeed in getting a new church built.
Sadly, the old church, full of termites, had to be torn down. There was no way to save it. Many of the artifacts from the original structure, like this termite-ridden beam, are on display today in Fellowship Hall. So a cornerstone was laid, and a new building began to rise at Barrett's Crossroads. For 6 months during construction, the congregation met for services in McLean High School. The new church was completed in 1956. It is interesting to note that several other original church structures can be found in the area. The first official manse was built in 1830 and remained in use until the 1940s, when it was moved to the Bayard Evans farm property nearby and restored. A new manse was built and still stands. Today it is used by the Pastoral Counseling and Consultation Center of Greater Washington. The Sunday School building, Dunham Hall, built in the 1920s, served until the 1960s, when it too was moved to Evans Farm. It now serves as a country store and gift shop.
We continued to grow while Reverend Newman was here. The congregation doubled. We had about 600 members by the time he left, and he was succeeded by John Graham.
Reverend Graham arrived in 1957 and served as pastor for 12 years. During the 140th celebration, Reverend Graham recalled the major accomplishments of his tenure.
And then we built the Heritage Hall here, had some difficulty with the graveyard, about disturbing some graves. And then we had the laying of the cornerstone and the erection of this building here. And then the change of the pastor was able to buy his own home in the area rather than use the manse, because the manse was taken over. And then the Colonel Eglin had the property behind the church, which we, just before his death, were enabled to take the first option on it, or have the when he died, to have the option on that land. And the congregation decided to buy this, and just before I left was the vision to offered that we make it into a retirement area or nursing home area for the people of the community.
Reverend Bill Tatum followed John Graham. As pastor during the 70s, he too remembers the indomitable spirit of a church which continually renewed its commitment to mission, and specifically the building of a retirement home in its backyard.
I think the thing that I remember mostly is all of the effort and work that went into building the Lewinsville, Roland. The way in which this church had so much leadership and how it could all come together, and that wonderful lady, Marie Lewis, the chairperson, and all of those who cooperated. And of course, all you have to do is to look today and to see that beautiful accomplishment that this church did, despite all the things, the hurdles that had to be surmounted, the bureaucracy of the county, the problems of financing. How could one little church do a $4 million project? And I think it's a testimony to this church. I think I remember that most fondly.
This is indeed a happy day. Groundbreaking for our Lewinsville retirement residents. An apartment complex especially designed to meet the needs of the elderly without regard to race, ethnic, or religious background, a place affordable to those with low or moderate income. This was our dream, and it has taken 6 years of dedication and patience and perseverance to bring that dream to reality.
The Lewinsville Retirement Residence is now operated through a corporation consisting of all members of Lewinsville Church. The retirement residence, which was completed in 1980, provides independent living facilities for over 150 people. When Reverend Tatum left in 1977, the church experimented with a co-pastorate form of ministry. Reverend John Smith was called from Canton, Ohio, and he remembers the challenge.
I remember it as a time of just learning together how to do ministry. I think it was, as I reflect back now, I think it was somewhat difficult for the session to wonder who's in charge here. And I know that was a constant struggle for us to try to define who's in charge and how it's going. But I think all in all, it was a good period and a growing period. And I think it definitely answered some needs for the congregation at that time. I think they were very anxious for Gary to continue, and that provided that opportunity.
Reverend Gary Pinder came in 1968 as an assistant pastor. He served with John Graham, Bill Tatum, and John Smith over an 18-year period of challenge and growth for both Gary and the church. When we spoke to him following the 140th anniversary service, Gary characteristically focused on his goals for the future.
Well, I see us now being in an area that that has undergone tremendous change. It is still growing, with new people coming into the area. Many of them single parents, many of them young professional persons who are living in condominiums and in townhouses in the area. And the area itself is growing, and I see our ministry as being one that needs to reach out to those persons and their particular lifestyles, to have them become a part of the life of the church and ministering to them.
Those 17 original members of 1846 built more than a church. They created a heritage and a commitment to live, to share, and to grow in the faith. This, then, was a special day for the church, one to reflect on the past while looking to the future, a thought captured by Reverend Gillespie in his anniversary sermon.
We look to those who have gone before us for foundations upon which they have so firmly built. But tied together on our journey, we must always be pilgrims and pioneers in the faith, those who are out ahead, blazing new trails, paving the way for those who will follow. That has been the story of the Lewinsville Presbyterian Church.
Today, we look to that heritage and commitment as prologue to a dynamic future for this congregation of God's people. Lewinsville is grateful for its history. We are more grateful for the opportunities, for new beginnings, and new visions, as we welcome an associate minister, Tad Wicker. Plan for a building program to improve and expand our facilities, and continue our journey of faith together. For the spirit of Lewinsville Presbyterian Church does not lie within its buildings alone. War, termites, and age take their toll there. Rather, the spirit of our church lies within the hearts and minds of its ministers and members. We are thankful for people who share concerns and laughter, for children, their energy and curiosity, their brave play and their startling frankness, for the young with their high hopes and boundless energy, for growing up and growing old together, for common hopes and hardships shared, for people who teach and learn, for people who come together in fellowship and prayer, for people who give of their time, their talents, and their love, and for the church into which we have been called, for the good news we receive by word and sacrament, for our life together in the Lord, building on our faith for another 140 years and beyond. The church at Barrett's Crossroads. Thus may she always be.